So I'll introduce our first speaker for this morning. So Nick Dreyer, he's the owner and consultant at Foundation Viticulture. Nick graduated from the University of Adelaide with a Bachelor of Science and then worked as a viticulturist with Orlando Wyndham in various regions of Eastern Australia. He worked very closely with the rootstock, with the Phylloxera board, with South Australia, and started to develop his knowledge of varieties and clones and their contributions in that role. He then moved to Yalumba Nursery, which is an amazing training ground for building that knowledge, and Nick spent a long time with the Yalumba Nursery building that knowledge both in propagation and then production and then in the winemaking as well. So I think we're really fortunate to have Nick over here, and I'd like to invite him to the table to share his knowledge of sparkling wine clones and varieties.
So thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to the day. I haven't spent much time in Western Australia, to be honest. So when it comes to writing these sorts of presentations, when I go into different regions, what I like to do is I like to use the experience that I've gained through, I was at Yalumba Nursery for almost 12 years, and so as Lee was alluding to, I've picked up a lot of information over that time, and that's all well and good, but what I like to do when I come to regions is make sure that I spend some time on the phone talking to local producers to get some local concepts and ideas to validate and build on the knowledge that I've developed over the years as well. So I really thank those producers that I was able to have a chat to about, particularly clones for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So anyway, I've been tasked with two and a half topics really. So looking at what varieties may be well suited to premium sparkling production in Western Australia outside of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, and that'll be a broad brush because there is quite a lot of variety. So really that's just going to touch on a few concepts and look at some resources that might help you make some decisions. The second topic is doing a bit more of a deep dive around the clones of Pinot and Chardonnay that are suited to sparkling production. And then I've got one slide on rootstocks, just because I can't help it. And I know rootstock use in Western Australia is low, but if you're going to use grafted vines or rootstocks for anything, I actually think sparkling vineyards, vineyards destined for sparkling wine would be the most obvious reason. So anyway, I'll get into that. Kicking off on the first topic. So just to sort of set the scene, if you can see that, but really, what are we looking for in sparkling wine? I know it's pretty obvious, but it's always good just to put it up there right from the start that we're looking for, high acid, low pH, lower soluble sugars, and that balance, and a very specific phenolic profile. And I'm sure the winemakers will go into that a little bit as well, but I just wanted to put that out there just to set the scene. When I was thinking about, how do I approach this topic, the first thing I thought about was, what's the global perspective? Outside Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Meunier, what other varieties are being used for, the classical sparkling wines of the world? And what are some of the minor varieties of champagne? So I put together a bit of a list, a bit of a starting point that we could look at, and then added in some information from what I could find around, are they being currently used in Western Australia? Are they actually available in Western Australia, given that you guys are your own little island here when it comes to access to varieties and clones? And then is it available in Australia? So I think when I looked at this list, I thought that the first thing that jumped out at me was that most of these varieties, apart from, perhaps Macabeo, Xarello and Paraleta, the Cava varieties, they're probably all varieties that you would nominally associate with cooler climate viticulture, I think. And so then I sort of jumped to the thought, well, if you're going to plant a cool climate vineyard, then you'd probably just plant, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir anyway. But I guess also this points out the fact that, these are being used successfully for, classical sparkling, wine products. The next thing I thought about was, well, what about in Australia? We want to have an Australian perspective. And what about some warmer climates as well? What are the varieties that we could mine and use for sparkling production? And one of my favourite resources is the Alternative Variety Wine Show database. And again, you may not be able to see that light's no good, but what that Alternative Variety Wine Show database has is basically it lists all of the wines that have been entered into that wine show over the last, 20 years. You can do a search for variety, vintage, you can see it all there, state where it comes from. And so what I did, and so I've used this, numerous times. It gives you a great way to sort of, really drill down and either find producers of a particular variety or a particular style associated with alternative varieties. But what I did is I put together a bit of an Olympics of, I thought it was appropriate for the moment, an Olympics. So a summary of the medals by variety awarded for the sparkling wine class at that particular wine show for the last 10 years. So I mined that data out, and then, as you can see there, there's the golds, the silvers, and the bronze. So the number of medals that each of those varieties has actually achieved, has jagged at that show. And then I've looked at, I guess, a medal tally for that particular variety, and then also highlighted 3 wines and 3 varieties that have consistently been awarded medals at that wine show. And I thought that's actually some pretty interesting information there. The thing that jumps out at me is, first of all, the success of Fiano. And I don't think that's necessarily a surprise. I mean, you look at Fiano, higher acid, really maintains its acid well, quite flexible in its production methods. You can do stainless, you can add some oak to it, so you've got some flexibility there. Oliver's Tauranga has really been, I guess, the standout sparkling Fiano across that show, and I think generally has been, well thought of, in terms of critical appraisal. And it is in Western Australia as well, and I'd be surprised if no one's actually making sparkling out of it now. But anyway, I'd put that up there as a good option. Lambrusco, certainly more of a warmer climate option. Trentham Estate, which is just over the border from Mildura in New South Wales. That was, I think, out of the 7 medals that variety was awarded, I think they got 6 of those medals. So definitely if you're in a warmer climate situation, I think Lambrusco Maestri would be a good option. Now, it's important to recognise that there's a lot of different Lambruscos out there. So I'm not convinced, based on some of the genetic work that I've seen, that the Lambrusco that you may have here in Western Australia in the Wavy collection is the same as the Lambrusco Maestri that's been awarded at this show. But it may be here, maybe through Steve Partridge's relationship with Chalmers. So that would be something to look into. So one of the surprises there was Marsanne, not a variety that you would necessarily associate with acid retention and those attributes that you would consider for sparkling wine production. Yet here it is, to Bilk, unsurprisingly, doing some good things with that variety and making a wine that has been consistently, medalled over that period of 10 years. Alianico, for a red in a warmer climate. That certainly jumps out as a potential, medalled 5 times. And the other surprise, I think, was Gewürztraminer. Again, similar to Marsanne, and not a variety that you'd necessarily ticks all the attributes for sparkling wine. But again, obviously, that the florals, the aromatics are jumping out, and I mean, realistically, you add bubbles to anything with some florals and aromatics and you've got something that's going to be all right. So it's probably what those 18 to 34-year-old males are drinking, maybe, I don't know. So that's just a really quick snapshot of varieties, potential varieties for sparkling production in Western Australia. Really, I could probably do a much deeper dive on that, but we need to get into, I won't say the weeds of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay clones, because that makes it sound, I don't know what it makes it sound like, but anyway, we'll go into Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Meunier. The Meunier discussion is a quick one. H10V5 is pretty well the only Meunier clone that's available. There is a Best's selection, which is not widely available, but if you're growing if you're going Meunier, then it's more than likely you're growing H10V5. So that's a nice quick, I don't think there's anything else out there that I know of. So we can jump into Pinot Noir to start off with. Before I do that, let's do a little bit of a summary before we go into the clones, because I think it's really good to set the scene. So, important to recognise that a clone is not going to magically turn a table site into a sparkling site. You know, clones are an overlay. Site is queen. You can't get around site. I'm sure Mick is going to go nicely into that, and it's going to be talked to a fair bit. So let's not kid ourselves. A clone is not going to make the difference. The discussions I have is, in terms of clones, there is a tendency towards clones with higher yields, and that's to, delay ripening. Let's get ripening, particularly the last stages of ripening, outside of those the warmer parts of the season. So there's definitely, benefits from higher yields, maintenance of acidity, and delayed ripening. Diversity is critical. Diversity is important for complexity. Diversity is important for providing flexibility in between seasons and within seasons, and certainly for sparkling wine production, having diversity opens up your harvest window. And when you're hand picking, you certainly need a nice wide harvest window. So diversity is important. And the final thought there is that realistically, when you bring new genetics onto your site, set your vineyard up to be adaptable into the future, because you don't really know where it's going to go, whether that's clones or rootstocks or varieties. Keep a flexible mindset with the way you establish your vineyard, whether that's with trellising or irrigation or whatever it is that you're doing. So Pinot Noir. Let's start with, I love coming to regions and you do some research and you jump into some local nomenclature like upright and droopy. It's great. I love it. And it did trip me up, I've got to say. I did some research. I sent this presentation through to Richard and he said, mate, you're going to have to redo a couple of slides around droopy and upright. I got it slightly wrong. And if you want to go into a deep dive, then read Richard's article on upright and droopy. It's meticulously researched. It's fantastic. And I'm sure Richard will send it through again. But to put it simply, to summarise, upright is most likely related to D5V12 and perhaps H7V15. There's some clustering in the genomic sequencing that works around those two clones based on samples from other collections. We know from experience that D5V12 and H7V15 are certainly clones that have a bigger bunch, higher yields, delayed, and have good acid retention. So, for me, they're classical, sparkling clones. In discussions with the 5 or 6 producers, it really only came up in one conversation, and that was a nice simple comment of it's performing well, and it suggests that it consistently outperforms droopy. Now, you've got to remember that's on one site, so we can't delve too deep into those direct comparisons. So we'll jump on to droopy. And again, I got tripped up. So my research suggested that droopy was in fact MV6, but Richard pointed me in the right direction. And what that meant is that, and now I don't have a slide on MV6 because I fixed this yesterday. So I'll talk to D4V2 and MV6 using this one slide and draw out the comments here to fix both. Droopy, based on the work that Richard has done and the genomic sequencing work, suggests that it's likely to be D4V2, also known as UCD4 or Pommard. It's not, I would say, I guess the popularity of this clone has increased across the eastern states over the last sort of 5 or 10 years. But it's a bit mixed up because, again, that genomic sequencing work that AWRI has undertaken has shown that a lot of the D4V2 is in fact MV6. So there's a few mixed messages going on here. So we've got to kind of tease them out a bit. But anyway, the point is that real D4V2 is more of a moderate, maybe pushing to high yielding clone, whereas MV6 is more of a moderate yielding clone. Both probably typically used more for table wine, but they do have flex either way. MV6 is slightly later ripening, it's not what I would call an early ripening clone, so that's in its favour, and same with D4V2, they do tend towards sort of slightly later ripening. MV6 probably has more colour, and that probably works, I guess, against it in terms of sparkling wine production. In terms of the local observations, the first comment there consistently hits the mark both stylistically and quality. That's associated with Droopy. Okay, that was someone was talking about Droopy. Selected as a clone for a new vineyard because it provides flexibility between table and sparkling. That specifically references MV6, so let's not get those two mixed up. And then the last comment was again about Droopy, so better suited to sparkling rosé because of its fruitiness, and picking early provides good acid structure. Now, that does speak to Droopy, but I would think, in my experience, that MV6 can be quite a fruity clone, and so I actually think you could probably suggest that comment for MV6 as well. So apologies for the little bit of confusion there, but the take-home message from those first two slides was that I would be using Upright, or that bigger bunch clone, for warmer sites, and then I would be looking at the other two clones probably in a cooler site if you were sort of comparing between the two. So moving on to 777. 777 is an interesting clone. It was always seen as when it came to Australia, as the next big thing. It was used widely in France, and was making great wine and all of that. And then we came to Australia, and as we do, we go and plant it everywhere, because it's the next big thing. But it is an earlier ripening clone, and in those warmer sites, we did find that it was ripening when it was still warm to hot, and those beautiful, delicate Pinot Noir flavours that we would like to get basically didn't occur. It got dry red. So, we've certainly seen an evolution in where 777 has been planted, and it's really now we're looking at definitely cooler sites, so we can avoid those heat periods and avoid those dry red characters. So it was actually interesting to me that, again, talking to a couple of producers, that 777 was seen favourably as a sparkling wine clone over here, albeit in cooler sites. One thing that also came up was that 777 was being used in existing vineyards out of necessity rather than design, because of that tendency of 777 does get a little bit in warmer years particularly, but it can shrivel. And so the idea was to basically pick it before the shrivel at Beaumets that are better suited to sparkling wine. So that was an interesting comment around necessity rather than design. And again, that final question that really I think pushes home that point that we need to be targeting 777 for cooler sites. It does get fat and untypical in warmer sites and warmer seasons. The other French clone that came up was 386. So 386 was actually a clone that was selected out of a suite of clones, or part of a suite of clones selected directly from Champagne. It is mid to higher yielding. It's not it's still a category B clone in the French system, so not category C, which is a higher yielding. But I think it was selected based on it's got good fertility, so it's consistent yielding, and sort of mid to late ripening. It's not widely planted in Australia, and probably not widely planted here from what I can gather, but one comment came through that it does produce wines with good sharp acidity or freshness, certainly something that's beneficial for sparkling, but also was seen as a potentially good clone for table wine as well, where you need to add in some freshness. So, if you're again going to directly compare 777 and 386, I think the take home would be 777 cool, 386 in a warmer climate where you can, benefit from that maintenance of acidity and the freshness that it gives. So that's just it's not a deep dive on Pinot clones. Again, I think that's probably a presentation on its own, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight, and happy to talk in the breaks anymore if you need some more information. So moving on to Chardonnay. So the first thing to do is to talk about gin and say that I think, based on what I could tell from conversations, that the take-home message would be use your gin for table and not for sparkling wine. The yield, the fruit characteristics, the composition doesn't lend itself to sparkling wine. Look, I could be wrong, but yeah, I think there'd be better clones for sparkling wine production. So we get to move on to the Davis clones. This is for you, Kate. I know you've probably couldn't sleep last night because of the excitement of hearing this part of the presentation. So the Davis clones, or V1, V3, V5, or 1, 3 and 5, or in the US they're known as FPS 6, 7 and 8. So they were specifically selected by Olmo back in let's say the 50s, as a direct response to only having access to the FPS clones that we relate to OF, Mendoza and Gingin, i.e., not phytosanitarily, they've got leaf roll basically, and they're low yielding. So they realised at the time, we need some clean clones that are going to give us consistent yields. So they went through the Martini vineyard, selected one vine, took cuttings from that, and then they put those cuttings through 3 different levels of heat treatment, and that led to remove the virus, and that led to, 6, 7 and 8, or what we call here 1, 3 and 5. Nothing like some different, clones, the different nomenclature can drive you wild sometimes. But anyway, that's where we're at. So as we all know, I10 V1, V3, V5, but in particular V1 are widely planted in Australia. And what I would say widely planted here as well. Good consistent yields. V1, I would say, is probably more widely planted. And in the comments that came back, and in comments from, I've chatted to Ed Carr before. It was last year I did a presentation in Orange. And for him and Arras, V1 has always stood out as, his preferred clone, not just in the early stages of the wines, but he thinks it ages, beautifully and is exactly what he's looking for his sparkling wine. And I think the comments here reflect that in many ways. The one thing with all of these, with these 3 clones is that, and as you move into warmer sites, but they're definitely cool climate clones. And as you move into the warmer sites, that elasticity, that time you have between pithy citrus mineral and tropical, that window gets shorter. So as you go into a warmer site, you really need to be on your mark with when you pick it, so it doesn't go into those tropical characters, which it can do. 3 and 5, I think, still have potential here, and certainly for one producer, that mix of those clones, they saw they were getting really good results. But I think the weight of observations, and again, I'm talking to 5 or 6 producers, but the weighted observations would lead me more towards, using V1 out of those 3 clones. The other Davis clone that we've imported is G9 V7, not widely planted here or overseas or in Western Australia, but I think there's some potential. Just again, doing a bit of further research, higher yielding, heavier bunches. My wife, she makes wine for Seppelt. She's got it at the Drumborg vineyard, loves it. Fat berries, she says. Really favourable skin to juice ratio. So again, and you can read the comment there from one producer around G9 V7. Obviously there's something going on there. Site, I'm sure, has a big part of it, but yeah, I think it's one to look at. Just a bit of yield data. I won't spend much time on that because I've probably been talking for too long. Jumping into finally the French clones. So starting with 95 and 76, these 2 clones are probably the most widely planted Chardonnay clones across the world, I would say. We imported them in Australia in the 1980s, late 1980s, and I think having that as an addition to what we had here has really led us to, producing the wines that are recognised, globally now. Interesting to look at the situation here. 76, there was some conflicting views on 76, standout performer, low acid retention. So, obviously some site things going on there. But I think where we see 76 and 95 working best is in those cooler sites, and we can really see that drive, that acid line, that pithy, that mineral, that minerality coming through. So definitely clones that, you would have a close look at. Comparing 76 and 95 in terms of yield, to 96 and 277, which are the other two out of that suite of 4. We can see very quickly here when we just look at the clones displayed as a percentage of average, 96 and 277 definitely higher yielding. And again, what we know about higher yielding clones is they're going to maintain their acidity, they're going to delay ripening, and probably if we're looking at again that take-home message between comparing that suite of clones, 95 and 76 for your cooler sites, and 96 and 277 for the warmer sites. 277 in particular as a high yielding. There were some good comments around it. Higher yield, higher acid, ticks the boxes of both quality and economics, and holds its nerve. So holds its freshness, holds its acidity during warmer vintages. So so I would look at making the distinction between those 4 clones. Again, I could probably do a whole presentation on Chardonnay clones, and more than happy to bore you later with knowledge that I've got. But I just wanted to finish with a quick chat about rootstocks. As I was saying, I think if you're going to use a grafted vine for anything, I think sparkling wine is the way to go. You're targeting high yields, you want a high canopy surface area, so therefore you should be looking potentially at higher vigour, deep-rooted rootstock like Poulsen, Regeri, and maybe even Ramsay at some gravelly warm sites. You're going to benefit from the high vigour, the productivity, but also those rootstocks will delay ripening. They've got a long vegetative cycle, so they're going to push you away from those warmer parts of the season into those, more autumnal, periods. So I can see benefit there. And they can also open up the potential for warmer sites or lower vigour sites. So again, I think if you're going to use a grafted vine anywhere, then sparkling production is where it's at. So again, just reiterating the points I made earlier, out of everything I said, it doesn't really matter if you don't have the right site. So, focus on that first, and all the rest you can read there. But thanks very much for your time, and look forward to some questions and a bit of a chat later. Thanks very much.